Seventh Sea is a swashbuckling, piratey, Euro-inspired fantasy tabletop role-playing game now entering its 3rd edition. The game is set on the continent of Thea, located on the planet Terra. The setting is heavily inspired by 17th century Europe. The 1st edition, published in 1999, was created by John Wick and Jennifer Brandes. It became well known for its signature D10 roll and keep mechanics and the establishment of its deep, intricate lore. It actually won the Origins Award for Best Role-Playing Game of 1999 and inspired a collectible card game. The 2nd edition was published in 2016 after a very successful Kickstarter that raised $1.3 million. This edition maintained the core world building, but represented a significant narrative-focused departure from the original system's mechanics. The game went on to sweep the ENnie Awards in 2017 with 2 gold awards for its rules, and the product line ultimately encompassed 11 different books. The 3rd edition, which is what this video is about, is being carried forward by Agate RPG under license from Chaosium. The goal of this edition is to modernize the classic D10 roll and keep mechanics from the 1st edition while ensuring that the lore established in the 2nd edition remains canon and serves as the foundation for the new era, which technically is only 10 years forward in the setting's timeline. At its heart, the goal of 7th Sea 3rd edition is to provide a heroic and cinematic system. You play as larger-than-life good guys who possess the swagger and courage to stand up to injustice, defy tyrants, and change the course of history. In this video, I want to walk you through the free quick start for this 3rd edition, which briefly touches on the game's European-inspired setting, and maybe most importantly, the highly polished mechanics. Then I want to briefly discuss how the developers are utilizing massive amounts of player feedback to guide their design choices for this game. And finally, I'll share with you my honest thoughts about this game so far. I do like the mechanics in this new edition, and we'll get to that in a minute, but I think what I'm really drawn to a lot more is the setting of 7th Sea. This quick start, unfortunately, does not do the setting justice, not by a long shot. As I mentioned a minute ago, just the 2nd edition alone had 11 books published for it, and those books detailed this really incredible fantasy version of Western Europe. And you won't be able to experience any of that richness in this 38-page quick start, but trust me, the setting goes pretty deep. As it is presented here, we have a planet named Terra, and on that planet is a continent named Thea. It's very similar to 17th century Europe, and we're primarily focused on 11 nations and a handful of organizations. Those nations are Avalon, a stand-in for England and containing both Arthurian legend and Shakespearean elements. Then there is Castile. This is a proxy of Spain that contains elements of Don Quixote and Zorro. Eisen is a sort of post-war Germany with elements of Faust and Brothers Grimm fairy tales. Sarmatian Commonwealth is inspired by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Inishmore is Ireland, full of Irish folklore, of course. Highland Marches is Scotland. Montaigne is pre-revolutionary France, Numa is Greece, Usura is Russian, Vestinmena is Scandinavia, Vodacci is Italy, and then you have the Vatican Church, you can guess which religion that is inspired by, and the Inquisition, which they didn't even change the name on that one. I do wish I could tell you more about the setting, but I'd have to dip into the first 2 versions of this game, and that's not really what this video is about. I guess looking forward, I am curious to see how in-depth they're going to get with the setting in the 3rd edition books. The one major thing I can show you out of this quick start is how the mechanics work. Each PC is comprised of 5 core stats called traits, and those are rated from 0 to 5. There are also 21 listed skills in the game for your character, and those are also rated from 0 to 5. Each character also has a list of special abilities referred to as advantages. These are abilities that introduce the real mechanical flavor of your character. They're broken up into 4 categories: passive advantages, situational ones that confer bonus dice under certain circumstances, heroic advantages that require spending a hero point, which is the meta currency of the game, and extraordinary advantages, which can only be used once per session. I do like how there's an iconography that sorts out each type. It makes referencing all the stuff on your character sheet a lot easier and faster because this section is going to get pretty wordy. Probably the most unique and maybe complex aspect of your character is combat aptitudes. When you create a character, one of the things you have to do is assign each of your 5 core stats to each of these 5 combat aptitudes. Mechanically, this will tie each of these 5 categories of action to that trait and its rating. So if my character is trying to sprint across a rooftop at night, that check would invoke the movement aptitude. If I happen to have listed panache for that aptitude, then that's the trait I'd use for that check. More on how checks work in a minute. There's also a softer, descriptive, narrative side to these aptitudes. For example, in the attack aptitude, I can assign any of the 5 traits to it. This will give my attacks a particular flavor. If I assign brawn to my attack aptitude, then my attacks have a brute force sort of motif to them. If I assign finesse, then all of my attacks carry precision and timing. Panache will invoke psychological offensives like taunts, insults, and banter, and resolve for my attack will give my character a particular relentlessness. Wits would lend my attacks a certain air of tactics and anticipation. Alright, so how do checks work? At its core, this is a D10 dice pool system. Anytime you need to make a check for a regular action, you as the player will choose a relevant trait and combine that with one of the 21 skills. Then you'll roll the number of D10s equal to that sum of trait plus skill rating. The next step is the GM will announce the difficulty target for the check. This ranges from 1 to 7. Let's say the GM sets the difficulty for a check at 5. That means that you have to roll 5 or more successes to actually succeed in the action. Successes on a die depend entirely on the rating you have in a skill. The higher the rating, the easier it is to roll a success. If you have no rating in the skill you're using for the check, then only 9s and 10s on that roll will count as a success. If you have 1 rating in a skill, then that threshold for all the dice rolled bumps down to an 8 or higher. A rating of 2 means that 7 or higher on the D10 is a success, and so on. This is made a little easier to understand with these numbers in the skills section of your character sheet. As you fill in ratings for a skill, you can look at the next number and that will tell you the success threshold if using that skill on a roll. If you happen to roll more successes than what was required by the difficulty for that check, then you get hero points. These points are actually kind of generously given. You get 1 point for every extra success that you roll. One thing to note is that out of all these skills, there isn't one for perception. Instead, you're meant to combine your wits trait with one of several possible skills like melee, empathy, or stealth, depending on what you're attempting to perceive. Anyway, hero points can be spent to do the following. These are all fairly unsurprising, except for these 2 things right here, at least in my opinion. The first is that you can spend 5 hero points to automatically succeed a legendary feat. That is, a check whose difficulty is 7 and whose result is, quote, mythic. The second thing is that the game doesn't limit how many hero points you can spend on a single roll, nor does there seem to be any limit on how many points you can stockpile. You do lose hero points at the end of a session, but think about this for a second. If extra successes are giving you 1-to-1 hero points, it's not inconceivable that you and everyone in your party could end up with a lot of these points. At which point you could potentially perform some story-breaking feats, maybe even 2 or 3 per session if you really hoard those points. But this is probably intentional. The designers are trying to engineer big heroic moments for the game. That's just the nature of the game. When they say swashbuckling to describe the game, they're backing that up with actual mechanics. There is a flip side to hero points called villainy points, and these are a meta currency that the GM earns anytime the player forces a failed roll to become a success. That's an option that they have called Force Fate. The shortfall in successes on a roll will become villainy points. Those points can be spent by the GM on each of these things. Even in the quick start, they spend some time unpacking the philosophy behind the GM point economy, one which I've encountered time and again on this channel. The big question is, normally a GM can pretty much do all these things without points, so why create a point system that gates these GM actions behind a paywall? The answer here, at least, is that the villainy points are meant to be publicly displayed to the players at all times to generate a sense of tension. They're meant to be the, quote, promise of a story. In a way, they're meant to act as karma. If the players keep pushing their rolls in order to cheat defeat, then that negative karma will build up right before their very eyes. And if the GM has a good sense of timing, those points will be spent at the most dramatic moments. The game defines two broad types of scenes, dramatic scenes and action scenes. In a dramatic scene, you can resolve actions by determining a simple success or failure using the standard check as described earlier. Or, to gauge how effective a solution is, the GM can forego setting a difficulty, and the player can just roll to see how many successes they roll at all. Opposed actions have two sides roll their trait plus skill of choice, and compare the number of successes against each other's rolls. Interestingly, there's no tiebreaker mechanic, which I find kind of anticlimactic. Extended actions will have the GM set the number of successes required to finish the task, and players then try to rack up that many successes. I usually see this kind of action paired with a timer or clock of some kind, but I don't see any mention of that here in the quick start. The second major kind of scene in the game is called the action scene, which isn't always a fight. It's just any fast, cinematic, or heroic moment in the fiction, and it plays out as a series of exchanges. By default, a PC will start the scene unless they're surprised, but even if they are surprised, they're rolling a reaction. That's because in action scenes, only the players roll the dice. In the case of actual combat, in any given round, the player will roll the appropriate combat aptitude plus skill plus applicable advantages, and then the GM decides if there's a counterattack or some other reaction in the world against the PC. If there is something for the PC to react to and it's risky, then the players will once again line up the appropriate combat aptitude plus trait plus advantages and roll. Each player will take their turn doing this, and when they're all done, the final step in a round is for the GM to describe a final adjustment to the scene, such as enemies repositioning or dangers advancing or progressing. Health in this game works by checking off so-called wounds. If wounds reach a sixth box, a dramatic wound is marked. Interestingly, each dramatic wound you pick up will actually confer an extra die to your pool anytime you roll. This wound die will generally contribute to your chances of success on a check and will explode, meaning you keep rolling it as long as it lands on a 10. However, if a wound die ever lands on a 1, the PC becomes defenseless until their next turn. If they fill their fourth dramatic wound box, they fall unconscious. It looks like from the text here that if a player spends a hero point, they are no longer unconscious and can continue taking actions, which to me sounds incredibly forgiving. The amount of leeway you get on damage here is very movie-like, where the heroes just keep going almost no matter what. Although, to be fair, you can't heal dramatic wounds during an action scene, and a fellow party member can only give you first aid once per action scene to heal regular wounds, so healing is a bit limited during the action. You don't get too much coverage of opponents in the quick start, but what they do explain is pretty interesting. There are essentially three classes of enemies. Brute squads, who are your lowest powered mooks. They don't have any defense and levy damage ranging from 1 to 5. You defeat brute squads with an extended action, which is to say they're all kind of lumped into one entity that is defeated by piling on successes. Then you have henchmen, who actually have names, traits, skills, and combat aptitudes, and sometimes even advantages. Taking them out requires landing enough damage to reach 2 dramatic wounds. And finally, you have villains, the bosses who are equivalent to PCs in every way, including the amount of dramatic wounds required to defeat them, which is 4. Tucked away at the very end of the quick start is a whole system of magic that one of the pre-gens uses called Sorte. This system is a magical framework that utilizes a tarot deck to allow practitioners to perceive and manipulate the, quote, threads of fate. A witch can perform a free reading using a wits plus sorcery roll to identify interpersonal links or a target's arcana, though they remain invisible within these threads themselves. Tactical manipulation is achieved through minor arcana, which are activated by spending a hero point or taking a backlash to grant bonuses like added dice or reduced difficulty based on the card's suit and numerical value. More powerful reality-altering effects are governed governed by the major arcana, which cost both a hero point and a backlash to trigger overrides, such as immobilizing targets or swapping minds with another individual. Every meddling with fate carries a pretty heavy toll, as each accumulated backlash removes 1 die from the player's future rolls unless they pay in blood by suffering wounds to clear the penalty. The development of 7th C 3rd edition has been done through a relatively transparent, community-centric design model where Agate RPG has utilized its Patreon to turn player feedback into a roadmap for the game's evolution. Following an initial survey that reached 1,500 responses, the studio officially decided to produce a 3rd edition rather than a simple supplement, responding to clear fan demands for a modernized roll and keep inspired by the 1st edition. The design process continues to be iterative, with the developers treating the community's input as a captain's log to guide technical refinements. For example, after the Phase 1 playtest in early 2026, the team identified and addressed specific concerns regarding wound penalties and the pacing of the new action-reaction system. So the developers aim to create a product that's aligned with player expectations before it even enters the Kickstarter launch. But alright, here are my thoughts on the game so far. Wishlist. Examples on when to spend villainy points. I'm always a little skeptical of GM points that are spent to buy actions against players, but I do like the rationale that the authors put forth here on how these meta points are supposed to function in the game. They're meant to display a looming and growing pressure on players who keep cheating rolls, but I'd love to see them take it a little further in the full core rulebook and demonstrate situations where GMs should use their normal authority to create adversity and when it's best to actually spend villainy points. Tiebreaker mechanic. I'd personally want a way to break ties on opposed actions, otherwise you could be wasting time with unresolved actions. 2 or 3 more systems of magic. I love the tarot-based Sorte Strega system, mostly because I love tarot cards, but I'd also love to see some other approaches to magic with other character archetypes. Ship combat rules. Part of the product identity of 7th Sea over the years is that there are pirates involved in the setting, at least as an option. I mean, look at the cover of this quick start, and the game has the word sea in it. That just leads me to really want some compelling ship combat rules. Nothing too complicated, but just some options for that type of encounter. Pros. High heroic drama. You don't die very easily in this game, and you get a lot of meta points to spend to massage the narrative. Just those 2 things alone make for a game that is going to set players up for a lot of heroic moments with minimal mechanical friction. Tying success to skill rating is clever. Since your skill level will pretty drastically affect your chances at success on a roll, skill carries a ton of weight in this game. This was a deliberate design choice to try and force players to focus on their balance of skills rather than just worry about traits, and I think it keeps each roll interesting, since the threshold is always different as you use different skills for each check. Skill list is a good size. 21 skills is more than Year Zero Engine's customary 12, but fewer than BRP's massive kitchen sink list of skills. I think this might be the sweet spot in terms of having player options, but not an overwhelming number of them. Each skill is still meaningful at a count of 21. It's a nice balance. Iconography for the advantages. This is really handy for quick references on what kind of special abilities you have on hand. So 7th Sea 3rd edition so far feels like a deliberate, carefully calibrated attempt to capture lightning in a bottle for a new generation of players. The core loop is already showing its strengths. It's fast, highly cinematic, and pretty shamelessly heroic. I'm a big fan of Pirate Borg, but I think if I wanted a more complex, deeper roleplay experience with more longevity and nuance, this might be the game I'd use for a pirate narrative. But obviously the setting could take you way beyond just a pirate narrative. Let me know down in the comments where in Thea you would want to take your table. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more RPG reviews, and join the channel as a member for exclusive videos and content. Links for everything are below. I'll see you in the next one.